For 20 years, the foundation of security has been find a vulnerability, prioritize it, patch it. You've been arguing that the approach can no longer be your main line of defense.
Finding and exploiting a vulnerability is a compute task. It's a search task. And what we've seen our entire lives, and certainly with LLMs, is the cost per task it continues to go down more than Moore's Law.
When you're out there engaging with fellow executives, are security leaders and boards actually ready to fund something that's starting from the kind of assumption that attackers are going to get in? Or kind of how are you hearing that in the conversation?
And even admitting breach is easy. It's a hard thing for most people to say.
So make the case for the audience. Why is this a permanent structural change in terms of how cheaply and quickly attackers can find flaws and not just one impressive demo or one unique situation?
So it's very cheap and very easy and very automated to find and exploit a vulnerability.
Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes. Today I'm joined by Doug Merritt. Doug, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me, Chris. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, likewise. We had a great chat, I think it was a week or two ago, about kind of the landscape and the lay of the land and things like that and everything going on with AI and software and cybersecurity. But for folks that don't know you, haven't come across you or your background, can you tell us a bit about yourself and the team?
Absolutely. I've been with Aviatrix almost 2.5 years now. The company Aviatrix is focused on how do we secure the cloud landscape for organizations. I know a lot of people are focused on cloud security. We're taking a little bit of a different stance. We're much more at the individual workload to workload layer and worried about blast radius and communication paths. Before Aviatrix, I was CEO of Splunk for just a little bit over 7 years and was with them a little bit before I was CEO. And there we evangelized really, really strongly that perimeter defense and prevention was important. Like none of these waves go away, but it was all about detect and respond. So it's ironic that I'm sitting here saying, hey, detect and respond is important, but it's all about blast radius and containment. We were pretty successful with that at Splunk for some good reasons, and I think it still is a really critical avenue for cyber teams and companies to focus on, but we've really got to start to begin to change our perspective, which is what I'm jumping up and down about with Aviatrix.
Yeah, I'm going to jump right into that because you've had, you and I were chatting about this, and you have like a series of kind of publications, internal and so on, that you guys have been talking about this, containment, this blast radius concept, things like that. And it starts with the thesis that AI has fundamentally changed offense. And I think we all see this, whether it's, autonomous offensive security, work coming out of Anthropic and Mythos, the open source ecosystem, you name it. There's reports from Firefox, finding hundreds of vulnerabilities. I think Mythos's update this past Friday, they've reported that Cloudflare had found 2,000 vulnerabilities with Mythos. And then we're seeing similar things in the open source community, right, with effective harness engineering and all those kind of activities. So, make the case for the audience. Why is this a permanent structural change in terms of how cheaply and quickly attackers can find flaws and not just one impressive demo or one unique situation?
Yes, for sure. We're in such an interesting time right now because there's so much noise. There are so many different things going on, and AI is one of those topics everybody focuses on 24/7. And AI definitely is changing some of the is one of the foundational and structural shifts behind some of the changes that we're all witnessing in the cyber landscape. But I'm going to peel back and just go in one step deeper, which is the attack approaches of the adversaries have continued to morph and become more sophisticated. And they are pretty well grounded. Like for any of you guys out there that want to go play with your LLMs after the show, just compete them against each other and have them review all the attacks that have occurred that have been publicly published over 5 months and ask them for the patterns. And what will come back is the game has completely changed. Not only are the attackers much more sophisticated and industrialized, they're working as a cohesive team and splitting up and dividing tasks, and they've got shared agreements and payments or remuneration, which is a little bit scary. And not only are they using AI to increase their speed and their efficacy, but they're changing what they're focused on. Right now, they're much more focused on valid entry paths. You'll see, if you go back to the attacks, they're harvesting credentials like crazy. How they get in to harvest those credentials, well, they got into everything's about trust. Like if you understand the trust graph across a landscape, and cloud has got a very, very convoluted trust graph of PaaS services the cloud providers provide themselves, SaaS services, APIs, core workloads that you put in of many, many different types. We can go through the same analogy with the development arena and the complexity of the entire CI/CD pipeline and how much trust there is up and down that pipeline. They're attacking the trust graph so that they look legitimate when they are inside your environment. And the old way of doing that was phishing. Like everyone gets too focused on how they get in. I say, well, that's interesting. The real question is where did they go and how did they do the damage? So the way that they used to get in was phishing, social engineering. How do I get credentials? They're way more effective at that now. They're injecting malware into public repos by compromising the CI/CD pipeline early, so that we can't even do a code scan on that code. Like it's a binary that I'm downloading from a trusted entity and putting it into my environment, and it is harvesting credentials and shipping those credentials out in an encrypted, in a very benign looking way, HTTP channel back out to the bad guys. And we've, again, everyone do their own homework, but you can see the OAuth shenanigans that are happening through different SaaS environments. They're coming in, and it's extremely difficult to determine what is nefarious and what isn't, which is what the whole detect and respond era was built on. Is if I get enough data, which is where we started with Splunk, data and then other things, if I get enough data and I really stare at it hard, I can see anomalous patterns. And then I can jump in with the SWAT team and we can just try it's a race. Can I beat them, shut the attackers off before they do too much damage? When the signal becomes difficult to discern, that mechanism it's still important, it's just limited.
Yeah, I think that part you used of it's still important but limited is key, because some people want to kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater, like, oh, XYZ is dead. And I feel like those are kind of like catchphrases that people throw out there, clickbait to get engagement and stuff. It's not that none of these things are valid or valuable anymore. It's just that they aren't quite as effective as they used to be, like as you're talking about. And to the supply chain piece, it's interesting because it's almost like we're infecting ourselves, like we're pulling in, right? We're infecting ourselves. And you made some comments in the articles that I read too, where talking about patching, and for 20 years, the foundation of security has been, find a vulnerability, prioritize it, patch it. You've been arguing that the approach, can no longer be your main line of defense. Even though you're clear, it still matters, for the bulk of everyday flaws. But help people understand where you draw a line between patching as basic hygiene and patching as like your primary defense, and how you keep, how do you keep a board from hearing the, CEO of Aviatrix says stop patching, which isn't what you're saying, but how do you kind of draw that line?
And it really goes back to what you said at the very beginning, Chris, which is any leadership job is about resource allocation and resource prioritization. And I wish that a leadership job was easy enough. You picked one metric and max that out. It's like, man, that'd be easy. I'd love the pay to do that. And in reality, you've got to juggle 40, 50, 60 different metrics or more, and you've got to balance your resources. So I'm arguing with containment is balance your resources. So you asked a really interesting, important question around patching. Is patching a good thing? Absolutely. Like, should we all work to harden our environments? Yes, we should. And that goes back to the prevention and perimeter defense era, which really was the core of cyber, 95 to 2010. We can debate the era, but cyber happened because we plugged the internet into our devices, into data centers, and prevention and perimeter was the response to, oh my gosh, we know how to make things more palatable and safe against this dangerous internet. Then we moved to this detect and respond era. When I go to patching, vulnerability detection and patching, that's a little bit more of the prevention and the perimeter piece. It's like, make sure they can't get in. Make sure that I am hardened and therefore they don't have something to latch onto. We just talked about, hey, they're not even doing that anymore. They're writing valid credentials. But if we shut down valid credentials, they'll go back here. So it's that hard allocation game. The dilemma, what worries me the most about the narrative I'm hearing right now with Mythos, are the LLMs increasingly powerful? Yes. I've not had a chance to play with Mythos. I'm sure it'd blow my mind if I got to play with it. But all the foundational models are moving very quickly. They're becoming much better at many tasks, including coding. And finding vulnerabilities and exploiting vulnerabilities is a coding task. So it's very hard to stop these engines from doing that. And I'm just going to trust the industry that Mythos finds vulnerabilities like we've never seen before. The concern I have is the narrative is find more and patch faster, find more and patch faster, find more and patch faster. With that orientation, we're not stepping back and thinking, what are the tools? Prevent, detect and remediate, contain. So we're overly rotated on prevent, and that alone is bad. But if you really look at the math, finding and exploiting a vulnerability is a compute task. It's a search task. And what we've seen our entire lives, and certainly with LLMs, is the cost per task it continues to go down more than Moore's Law. Like the cost per token is insane what the deflation has been around that. So it's very cheap and very easy and very automated to find and exploit a vulnerability. Patching is really, really different. Patching has got a bunch of ceilings to it that will never match the vulnerability find and exploit piece. And like when any engineering team, you're worried about this gap of like bugs versus bug resolution. When it's going like this, it's really bad. Vulnerabilities are going like this. Patching has got a ceiling and cannot match the pace of the vulnerability to detect and exploit. And for all of you out there, like most of you are technical, you understand this. There's massive consequences to every single patch. Like every piece of code, it's a crazy interconnected web. And when you change anything in your environment, it has a possibility of really bad consequences. It could bring down your system. It could, even the evaluation cycles of, can I patch this? And what happens if I patch it? A very different time and delivery than what we're doing over here with the attackers, much less the organizational friction and the actual systems friction and deployment friction of patching. So we're never going to go fast enough. Over a 5 to 10 to 15 year trajectory, could we get to hardened environments? We probably can. The engines will keep progressing. Humans will become less in the loop, probably. We'll find a way to get there. That's not what I'm worried about. I'm worried about how do we manage the next 12 months, 18 months, 36 months. Like that is the immediate problem in front of us.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to frame it is that, several things you said there. First off, the compute kind of the economic side of it, that's been validated by organizations like the UK's AI Security Institute. They showed us essentially it's just like vulnerability discovery and exploitation, even multi-step attack kill chains they showed, it's just a compute problem at this point. Like the more compute you can throw at it, and the more effective
you can do and the faster it can go. Yeah.
Yeah, and then and this is something Sergey Epp had a great quote on this, blog on this. He called the verifier's law in terms of how trivial it is to write and exploit vulnerabilities with AI versus the kind of softer aspect that you talked about, organizational politics, competing priorities, incentives, like all these things that drive patch prioritization and operations within an organization. It's not a compute problem per se. You can't just throw compute at it. It's more complicated than that. And so you've been making this case for containment, and containment is one of these things that the industry has slapped on, everything for a decade: firewall, segmentation, endpoint tools, posture products. You've tried to give it a pretty strict definition in the writing that I've read from you, where you have to give it kind of a handful of tests to pass. Things like governing every path a workload can take, working at the level of when an application is actually able to access rather than just an IP address, or holding firm whether or not anyone detected the attack yet, things like that. For someone hearing this kind of framing of containment for the first time, what's the simplest way to kind of explain and help understand the way you're framing containment in the market today?
And it's a really good point that you started with, Chris, which is containment can be applied to many different areas of the landscape. And all those areas matter. So going back to what can endpoint solution do around containment? What can identity solution do around containment? Those are all really important. The advocacy I've been driving is the network containment layer, really the workload containment layer, and the ability to both invoke it, to both understand it and then invoke it. And to do that, the only way that we can find is you've got to understand the network and be able to utilize the network, because you need something that is pervasive, consistent, and accessible. And where something like endpoint and agentic falls down is when you've got ephemeral workloads, which are the majority of workloads in our landscape today, or it depends on the organization, but it's the increasing number of workloads. It's really difficult to instantiate something that has the characteristics of something like an agent. So you've got to be able to use the network. But the core elements that we have been focused on for what do you need? Like why is network containment important? Why don't we start there? Because most of the data centers that I have visited or helped supervise in my past had network segmentation, ingress and egress filtering pervasively. Macro segmentation is part of my network segmentation, IDS and IPS as standards. Like it was just the mandated footprint of those data centers. In cloud, it's very different. I was shocked as we started to decompose and recompose Splunk in the cloud. And then I came to Aviatrix and working with hundreds and hundreds of companies on their network and cloud landscape. Very, 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 very different environment. In cloud, what they have rotated on very effectively is identity is default deny. I can't do anything with my workloads in my cloud landscape until I validate who I am and I'm approved, which makes a lot of sense because they've got an economic engine and someone needs to own that workload that they spun up. Most of the other permissions across the cloud landscape are overly permissive, open to all, and networking is one of those. Why? Why is that the case? Well, the economic engine of the cloud service providers is developer velocity, and security is friction. And if you had a default deny policy on every workload in the network layer, it would just add friction. So I've already done default deny at identity for a good reason. That's how I get paid. That's how we kick off the relationship. If I continue down that path and my other competitors didn't, they might get more workloads than I'd get. So the current state within most customers' utilization of workloads in a cloud is horrific at the network level. Again, you guys can all go out there and test it right now. Spin up any new agentic frameworks from the cloud providers and look at the network, the recommended default network permissions. It's open to everybody, which again scares the crap out of me just thinking about that. It's like really this thing that has got very, very broad reaching communication capability and very high permissions has got a default stance that is connected to the internet and anyone can come in or go out without any type of surveillance or control. So that our whole orientation on a containment platform to solve the biggest issue that most organizations have is how do we help, what are the tenets to have workload level containment at the network layer actually occur, and how do you do it on a progressive and safe basis?
Yeah, I think it speaks to what I call like the security usability trade-off. Like it feels like the hyperscalers, the frontier labs and model providers, et cetera, are kind of optimizing for usability over security, of course. Like we saw this early days with cloud, is they want to make it as accessible and easy to use as possible, right? But with that comes very kind of damning security implications, I guess you could say.
Yes.
We had a decade before S3 buckets were private by default. Like it was ugly, and many incidents before finally things changed. And you're kind of advocating we need to get ahead of that in terms of solutions of kind of mitigating that default openness posture. I want to ask you this too. Given that your role as a CEO, multi-time CEO at this point, I'm sure a lot of your conversations are at the executive level. Your core reframe around containment is kind of a mindset shift. Instead of like pouring everything into reducing the odds of getting breached, you say kind of accept it as an inevitable kind of consequence of the ecosystem of the landscape, and instead controlling how far the attacker can spread once they're in. What you call the blast radius, right? The challenge, of course, is that entire careers, budgets, board conversations are built on the promise of prevention, right? So when you're out there engaging with fellow executives, are security leaders and boards actually ready to fund something that's starting from the kind of assumption that attackers are going to get in, or kind of how are you hearing that in the conversations? And I feel like we've always said like it's not a matter of when, or not a matter of if, but when kind of thing. But practitioners say that the way we spend and allocate security budgets, it often is very prevention heavy, right? So I'm curious how that's going in the conversations you're having.
I think that the biggest obstacle for our own way of life and cyber health is that education, that mindset shift. Because I do think that we have villainized the corporations. Right? If you are breached, you are bad. You've done something wrong, and it's a natural response by citizens. It's like, you're supposed to protect our stuff. Like, someone broke into your building, you must be at fault. But we wouldn't generally do that on the physical world. Now, if someone took a rock and got in through a window and was quick enough to get in and out before the alarms and the police showed up, you wouldn't completely lambaste that organization. And we don't have the same consequences in the cyber world that we do in the physical world right now, because most of the attackers are not in a location where they're going to be held accountable. So radically different landscape for these poor corporations. But I think everyone's been conditioned to, you've got to prevent. And even admitting breach is easy. It's a hard thing for most people to say. But if you don't start there, you're in way worse trouble. If we just go back to, why are people focused on patch as quickly as you can? If Mythos, and again, forget Mythos, if 2026, all the frontier labs and core foundational models, including the open source, open weight models, are getting to the levels that we've been seeing, then zero-day exploits are not going to be very difficult for any adversary to go after. So that prevent thing becomes almost impossible. So if you just accept the logic of, both through the valid credential writing that we're seeing, the very sophisticated attacks that people are driving to look like they're non-anomalous, and then the wide open aperture of potential zero-day and vulnerability exploitation versus your patching speed, you are going to get breached. And it shouldn't be a surprise or bad if you are. The core vernacular needs to be, and I do think this is a board level, a governmental and board level discussion, so what's your remedy? Like, if breaching is kind of common and we all have got a challenge making that stop because the adversaries are nation states or in places we can't chase them, what do we do? Like, we can't just lay down and our way of life stops. That's where I go back to containment. Like, every runtime layer, identity, endpoint, and network as the three, better have a very robust containment orientation. And it really is the blast radius. If something gets breached, from where they landed, how far can they go? Because that determines the damage, the scope, and that damage is what we need to prevent. Is if you can localize the damage, then a few people might be impacted, or a small part of the system might be impacted, but it's a recoverable event. And ultimately, we're always trying to build resilient businesses. We get dinged all the time in our day-to-day life. An employee quits, he didn't want to have quit. You get a lawsuit from something you didn't see coming. You get hacked. Like, how are you as resilient as possible? And blast radius and containment help increase your resiliency so that when something happens, it's not catastrophic.
Yeah,
It's got to become a boardroom metric. Like, board. Yeah. CISOs, CIOs, and CEOs and boards better be able to answer quickly, like in the coming months, what does my graph look like? What does my graph look like for my landscape? And how reachable how reachable is anything from anything else? What is my blast radius quotient? And you don't want it to be 100%. Like, you want it as low as possible for anything you have in your environment.
Yeah, I think it's a great way to frame the landscape of, the impact of AI on exploitation and the industrialization of it, as you said in the earlier part of the conversation. And then just, preparing from an organizational perspective, knowing that we're facing this, what can we do to mitigate the impact when it happens? Because it's very likely to happen to nearly every organization. And I wanted to ask you as well, there's all these categories in cyber, and, they kind of rise and fall based on the trends. And one of those that's getting a lot of focus right now is identity. And I kind of want to talk about maybe why, and this is something you talked about earlier with credentials and OAuth, like why a strong front door maybe isn't enough on its own, right? We've heard for years, like, identity is a new perimeter, and if you can get login and access controls right, you're in good shape, right? You're kind of pushing back on this in some of the pieces I've read, particularly in the cloud, where your point is, like, identity only answers, is this person or system allowed to do this? Not, is this an allowed action, actually an attack, right? And
Right.
you know that the vast majority of intrusions, happen with completely valid stolen credentials, and they don't
Right.
set off any alarms. And it's the kind of the age-old quote of attackers don't hack in, they log in. So can you explain why like a strong identity layer by itself, can't catch the modern attack landscape and trends that we're seeing, especially when the thing being compromised is a machine or an automated service or an agent, things like that.
Exactly. Yep. So identity is critical, and it has a perimeter, and we should have as strong of an identity stance as humanly possible. But as you said, Chris, it typically is the front door. It typically is the access point, and from that authentication, all the real work gets done. Right? That's where I worry about our over rotation. Like, how did someone get in? How did the actual breach occur? And under rotation on what were all the fun little steps along the way that resulted in something pretty cataclysmic happening. Malware detonating across huge chunks of the estate, or critical data sources being harvested and held for ransom. It always is a lateral movement and egress problem. So defense in depth as a core thought process is built upon layers. Identity is a layer. To say I've got a strong identity stance, therefore I'm good, is irresponsible, I believe. If you assume that identity can be hijacked, just forget that. Assume that an employee who's been a good employee for 20 years has a bad day and makes a pretty big mistake, or just wants, is mad at their boss. Like, what do? If that's your only control, forget credentials hijacked. Like, you just got to trust a person that's not acting the way they once should. You're lax on your actual stance. So if you think through systems, the elements of identity that pertain to a human and what a human's allowed to do, or the elements of identity that pertain to an agent, which is kind of human, kind of workload, it's a little bit weird, and then the elements of identity that pertain to a workload are all different. You need different structures to do those three well. Workload has, again, been underserved from a paying attention to how do you designate what a workload is supposed to do, and then how do you address that workload based on a designation that isn't too literal. Go back to most workloads are technical, and there's a lot of technical designations to that. What is the IP address for this workload if it's a static workload, as an example? And to do it properly, a lot like human or agent identity, you've got to up-level it a little bit. What is this thing? Is it a database? What kind of data does it hold? What should it be communicating with? What systems is it part of? But if you have the right identity in a workload, and you're willing to take a workload containment stance, workload by workload, you can now have a defense in depth strategy that when an identity is spoofed, you get a separate set of controls that will ensure that you don't need to understand if something bad is happening or not. You don't need to understand if you're in the middle of a breach. That we're arguing that containment is disconnected from detection and remediation. A workload is trying to do something it doesn't normally do. It's communicating with a channel it shouldn't communicate with. Whether there's a breach or not, you should stop that activity, pause, and verify that that's the right thing to do or not.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was going to ask you as well, maybe another question or two as we round out the time here. The concept of, you call it blast radius, and there's in the practice of microsegmentation, right, has been around for a long time. It was something advocated for as part of zero trust, right? What do you think remains the biggest impediment or blocker to organizations implementing this? Because I've seen a lot of organizations and enterprise go down the path of trying to move towards this, and then they are afraid of blocking the business or disrupting traffic or causing some kind of an issue, and they often end up kind of observing rather than enforcing a lot of the microsegmentation efforts and blast radius efforts, containment efforts, and so on. And then also, what's different now in terms of the technologies and capabilities that we can bring to bear that maybe we couldn't, in prior technological waves?
I think most humans and most cyber teams are very nervous about any type of containment and blast radius approach the way we're talking about, because it can interrupt the system. And microsegmentation I put as the most sophisticated set of processes on what we're advocating around blast radius and containment. I do think that the world has changed to make something like microsegmentation much more approachable than it has been in the past. Why are people nervous about invoking anything around blast radius? Because the systems are supposed to communicate. That is their job. For me to conduct an e-commerce transaction with a retailer, I'm expecting my systems to communicate. If I put a filter in that stops that communication, I'm not collecting revenue. I'm disappointing my customers. My manufacturing floor isn't working. So you've got to be very, very thoughtful about containment. And the more gates you put in, the more chance there is for system interruption. But I think the main impediment has been cognitive load. Is when you get to the point where you are trying to both evaluate the communication pathways and put the right filters and blocks around every single workload. You've got tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of workloads within an environment. That graph becomes very, very complex. And most human beings have a very difficult time understanding, like, what are the different combinatorial effects that are occurring, and am I going to shut this darn system down or not? I think there are ways with visual metaphors, how you display graphs and what you zoom in on to help humans. But I think the big breakthrough here is AI. And that's what we're seeing with the renditions that we're driving internally and out to our customers. AI is very, very good at synthesis and pattern matching. The biggest challenge we have as humans is, do we trust the AI or not? We're building this in a way where we just display and then begin to recommend and then begin to automate, and then potentially just let the system become autonomous. So there is a trust graph that you can go down to get there, but it's very similar to what we're advocating for containment overall. It's where you started, Chris, is when you put something like an Aviatrix into your environment, just let it observe. Just allow yourself to see the graph. What are all the different workloads and what are they communicating with? And then begin to discover, right? All right, so what are the heaviest patterns, and why those patterns exist? And then begin to monitor. Where you can say, all right, if I begin to put a filter or a block around these different workloads within these patterns after I've discovered, is it going to be okay or not? And you've got to have easy rollback on all of these. And then finally, after monitor, I think you can get to, all right, let me start to enforce. Let me see what happens if I put the blocks in. And what we are advocating for is start at the easiest areas. Start with egress. So many customers I've walked into have got thousands of workloads that are directly connected to the internet. And egress is the wrong term now because it's ingress and egress. They've got direct connectivity to the internet and there's no filter at all. Like, there's no one's watching them in any way. Just start with shutting those down. And that's way simpler than macroseg, which a macroseg is way simpler than microseg. So just take these, start with that, observe, to discover, to monitor, to enforce. And even when you do that, start on the easier areas, egress, and then work your way toward the high fidelity areas. But I do think AI is going to be a huge benefit to making this a self-learning, workable, cognitive, manageable system for organizations.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think a couple things I want to highlight there is, one is us as a defender, right? We hear about the business, we hear about the attackers leveraging AI to be more effective, more efficient, more capable. We need to be doing the same as defenders, right? Leveraging this technology for our own use cases. And I love the framing of the kind of the tiered maturity model approach, right? Where you're not just trying to boil the ocean, you're trying to solve it all at once. It's not a silver bullet or a panacea, as you say. Like, you start with a tiered approach. With the easiest to the most difficult kind of use cases within the organization. So I wanted to ask you as a last question here, as it pertains to containment and this concept of the blast radius and so on, network level security, any call to action you want to put out to the community, anything they should check out, keep an eye out from the Aviatrix team and so on?
One, for any of you guys that want to go to aviatrix.ai and check out our Threat Research Center, I love feedback. I love it. I find it fascinating. The team there does a really good job of breaking down, of both tracking different exploits that are public and then breaking them down, which is what I've found is in short supply, is how do you make this very visual and thorough end to end so you can see the patterns and really understand what's happening. But for all of you out there, I really, again, I want your ideas. Email me, dmerritt@aviatrix.com, push back on anything that Chris and I have been talking about, but I want your ideas on how do we make blast radius and the overall communications graph one of the primary elements that senior leaders stare at. Because I am very personally worried given my insider knowledge of what those graphs look like, especially in cloud, across major Global 2000 companies around the world, not just in the US. Because when you combine what the sophistication of the attackers and the industrialization of their approach with the tooling that they have and the cost deprecation that's occurring with the AI tooling and other tooling they have, that's a bad equation. If you're that wide open, there are too many entry and exit points, and the kill chain becomes way too easy for people to execute against. And we've just got to make it harder. Like it's, but I need your help. I need your ideas and help on how do we advocate this together in a way that works for all of you, so that you get the support from senior management. Because it's a education and mindset shift for folks.
Love it. Yeah, there you go, folks listening in. There's a call to action to the community, right, to give some feedback to Doug and the team on how to champion this with the board and the executive leadership. I think as a practitioner community, we all agree that this containment, this blast radius concept is where we need to be heading, right, given the age we're in. But how do we effectively kind of champion that and advocate for it from the security perspective to our business leaders, executives, and so on. So, Doug, thanks so much for jumping on and talking about this with me. Really fascinating stuff. And then again, a plug for the research from the team. I'm a nerd who loves to read the reports and the details and the visualizations and stuff. And so that's been great to check out too. So check it out at the website there. And Doug, thanks so much for jumping on.
I really appreciate you having me, Chris, and a great conversation. Look forward to more.
Take care.